At this time, we'll go into our fourth panel, which is Policy Implications of New Trends and Challenges, and moderated by Celeste Ward-Gaventner. And she's going to introduce the panelists. A few words on Celeste. She is the Associate Director of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law. She previously was the Senior Defense Analyst at RAND Corporation. And prior to joining RAND, she was with the Office of Secretary of Defense. She joined the Secretary of Defense after her second tour of duty in Iraq. We appreciate your time, Celeste. Thank you.
Right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you all so very much for coming, and I think you'll agree this has been a fascinating day and a truly fascinating presentation by Congressman McCaul. This panel is called Policy Implications of New Trends and Challenges, and originally we were thinking of trying to bring together the insights that we heard this morning and try to identify the so what, well, what do we do about this, about what we've heard. Very struck by Congressman McCaul's tour d'horizon of all of the threats and challenges facing the United States in an era when our fiscal situation is so dire. And so how do we make these two things come together? Intense, diverse challenges, but very few resources with which to deal with them. But I think the other thing we'll be privileged to do in this panel is hear from our law enforcement colleagues. And we're incredibly lucky to have representatives from several law enforcement agencies here on this panel. And I think what you'll hear is us returning a bit to some of the themes from this morning on the border challenges and how it looks from their perspective. So really looking forward to all those. So let me just quickly introduce my panelists, and then their biographical information is in the handout that you have. I have here next to me Bobby Chesney. He's a professor at the law school here at UT and also a distinguished scholar with the Strauss Center and a valued colleague and a very distinguished voice on issues of terrorism and national security. So we're very grateful to have him here. I also have here Greg Thrash. He is with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. First I have Michael Reyes from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And finally, Hector Gomez from the U.S. Marshal Service. So why don't I just go ahead and go this direction. And thank you all very much and look forward to your comments. So, Bobby, please.
Thanks, Celeste. Can everybody in the back hear me all right? So I'm an outlier on the panel in that I'm the academic, and so perhaps in the spirit of diversifying the portfolio, it'll be good to start with me. I'm going to bring very much an academic perspective to bear in thinking from a strategic perspective about the cartel violence issue. Will had mentioned earlier in the other panel that I do spend a lot of my time and work thinking about detention issues as well related to terrorism. Very happy in the Q&A if people want to change the focus away from cartels and bring that topic up. I'm happy to talk about it then. Won't actually say anything as we're going through here, except a little bit indirectly in my opening remarks. So here goes. First of all, one of the truly distinctive strategic developments of the past quarter century at least concerns the increasing strategic salience of non-state actors. And this is a very familiar observation. It's not original to me. Some have gone so far as to say that we're sort of living through the demise of this very familiar nation-state dominated model we've had for a very long time now, the sort of the Westphalian period, as some would say. Even if you're not prepared to go that far, though, I think we'd all agree that the basic insight that non-state actors have a greater strategic role to play in both domestic affairs or national affairs and international relations, that seems clearly correct. To some extent, it's a function of technological change, and especially digital technology. Fred talked earlier about the emergence of Google and Twitter, the magnitude of these operations and the impact of them. I would add WikiLeaks to that list. That's one aspect in which it's manifested, and that's a relatively benign aspect, although people obviously will have mixed opinions on WikiLeaks. Not all non-state actors are even arguably benign, however. Many are obviously malignant, and famously since 9/11, and for many observers before that, but certainly for all of us since then, we've come to appreciate just how destructive non-state actors and how significant that destructive capacity can be. It's not an entirely new phenomenon. What's different is that the amount of violent impact or disruptive impact on legitimate legal orders these groups can have is on a scale that wasn't previously attainable in times past. Now, for my part, from the perspective of the law school where I sit normally, what's interesting about all this is that the non-state actor scenario really disrupts the legal frameworks that govern how a state like the United States at the federal, state, and local levels can use its powers to grapple with these sorts of entities. The non-state actor framework we've come to appreciate, has blurred lines that are familiar to us, like the line between crime and war, the line between what's domestic and what is foreign, the line between the relevance of the distinction between citizenship and non-citizenship, and more generally the line between state action and non-state action. This started to get a lot of attention in the 1990s with the emergence of mass casualty terrorism as a widespread phenomenon, and appreciation of it really crystallized with the 9/11 attacks themselves. So we've had a decade's worth of attention on the terrorism front, where terrorism is the manifestation of this trend. But mass casualty terrorism is not the only way in which these trends are manifested. Now, we see it in other realms, some of which have been mentioned today. One is cyberspace. The threats to U.S. national security and to the international order are increasingly manifest, as Fred laid out in great detail earlier, and as Congressman McCaul also referenced in his talk. As a result of widespread appreciation for this threat, you've got a great deal of both legal and policy thinking going on about how to come to grips with it. The questions remain undetermined, or rather the answers remain undetermined, but the questions are at least being asked and studied. Things are substantially different with respect to this second emerging arena of changing strategic impact from the non-state phenomenon, and that's cartel violence, which we've been grappling with throughout the day. As Congressman McCaul said at lunch, we have not paid enough attention to both the big picture and the small bore issues that are raised by this phenomenon. So I want to help us think along those lines and offer a few thoughts, and it'll be interesting to me to see how well what I say does or does not match up with what the far more expert people to my left, your right, have to say about this. So feel free to hold me to account on that. The cartel violence phenomenon is akin to cybersecurity and akin to mass casualty terrorism insofar as it hits right on the seams of our conventional modes of thinking about the law and policy of national security in particular. It involves non-state actors who have many attributes we associate with state governments, including having a military apparatus, having an intelligence apparatus, having the capacity to project force on a strategically significant level, the capacity, even if not always exercised, to actually control territory and to displace legitimate government institutions. It involves both citizens and non-citizens of the United States, making that complex. It involves trans-border aspects where the conventional political boundaries, as was talked about in the first panel this morning, seem not to matter so much. And last, coming to grips with the DTO or cartel phenomenon raises exceedingly difficult questions about exactly who's in and who's out when it comes to defining the boundaries of these entities. It's much like terrorism in that context, difficulties of attribution, if you will. So many of the familiar confounding elements are present in this context, just as they are with cyber and with terrorism. And yet, even though the attention finally did start to catch, the U.S. mainstream media's attention finally did start to focus on this issue about this time last year, and though many in this room in particular, and certainly on this panel, have been grappling in a sophisticated, nuanced way with this issue for a long time, on the whole, we just haven't gotten as far as we need to in thinking it through. With my remaining minutes, let me offer a few thoughts to help us think about one particular slice of this question, and that is it a first-tier national security threat or something like it? Now, to be clear, since I'm worried I'll be misunderstood in this point, it's obviously a first-tier crime control threat. There's just not an issue, I think, there. It's obviously a crime control problem for the United States. The separate question I want to raise is it a national security phenomenon akin to terrorism and cybersecurity in terms of its magnitude or something like that? And my goal is to get us to think a little bit, to act rigorously in thinking on that topic. So, first of all, a couple of preliminary observations. One is that the way we think about what counts as a national security threat has changed a lot in recent years. There's an evolution in what this concept means. You could go back some period of time and find a general agreement that this has to do with things like Russian ICBMs and WMD proliferation, where there's a clear military connotation or an intelligence connotation to what's going on. In recent years, it's become vogue to refer to other things, refugee flows, food scarcity, energy competition, and any number of other such things as also being equally significant from a national security perspective. And at some level, that's clearly correct. But at another level, there's a distinction. And the distinction is as follows, that original core notion of national security gets at problems that one would expect to see addressed by conventional military and Title 10, Title 50 means, military means, and intelligence community means. These other problems may or may not implicate those same modes of response, and you don't necessarily turn to the traditional national security tools in responding to them. So I would say they are both national security threats and not quite the same as these more traditional threats, and this will be important for the cartel thing. Secondly, we've become very accustomed to thinking of non-state actors as, generally speaking, national security threats of the highest order in that more traditional core sense, for the very obvious reason that the non-state actors we've been dealing with, Al-Qaeda and so forth, are using military force or military-style force violence in causing death and destruction in a strategically significant sense. But it's not automatically the case that all non-state actors have the motive, means, and opportunity to project force against the United States in that way. So we have to be very wary and careful in our analysis. Now, maybe I'll solicit some input from you, since I am a law professor and I'm used to calling on people. I won't call on you, but I'll open the floor a bit to ask you to help me think this through. If we're trying to pin down how, I won't call on y'all. How might the cartels actually be said to threaten U.S. national security, directly or indirectly? What are some of the possibilities, even if not fully manifest yet? What would you say? You might want to throw something out there. Too soon after lunch to do this?
I got one.
All right, let's hear it.
All right, working with terrorist elements from the Middle East, say, and
Okay.
facilitating their action.
Right, facilitating entree into the United States, for example, that's a good one. So they could become a magnifier or a enhancer of the threat posed directly by others. And very much, it doesn't have to be just non-state actors, and we can think about the tri-border region in South America and Venezuela both, and really complicate that. Add financing to it. There could be meetings of mutual interest in terms of the money-making interests of the cartels and perhaps what they might be willing to do in exchange for funds. Will?
More directly, just cartel violence spilling across the U.S. border, where it's now taking place inside American cities.
Right. So that starts to sketch some of the parameters here. And so let me kind of recap and add a few as well. Now, obviously, some of the themes from this morning, there's the indirect national security threat to the United States from the very direct national security threat to the Mexican state. Insofar as the Mexican state is undermined, let alone collapsed, but undermined by cartel violence, that has implications, of course, for our foreign policy, for our economy, and for any number of things. Even if it doesn't come to that, increases in refugee flows or increases in economic disruption, these are all ways in which harm to Mexico can indirectly impact us. Insofar as you end up with ungoverned spaces in Mexico that are south of our border, these facilitate the types of concerns that Celeste was identifying. The thing to really watch out for, of course, is what Will identified, is the actual projection of force into the United States. And Congressman McCaul talked about the horrific attack on our ICE agents in Mexico. The thing to look out for is something like that going to happen on a more sustained basis, or was that episodic and one-off? Is it going to happen on a more sustained basis in Mexico? And God forbid, will it begin to happen on a more sustained basis, in a systematic basis within the United States itself? To be sure, the cartels can and do express themselves violently in the United States in ways that have to do with racketeering and organized crime and the drug trade. But what I'm talking about is actually projecting force in strategically significant ways against the United States and its at the state, local, and federal law enforcement levels. Not all of the things we've just talked about resonate with first-tier national security concerns. All of those are terribly important, but many of those things are indirectly implicating national security or leveraging other national security threats. Only when we get to that projection of power scenario do we really talk about treating the cartel violence from a U.S. perspective as being something very much akin to Al-Qaeda or terrorist organizations and the threat that they pose. So which of these is happening will tell a lot about how much of a priority this ought to be from a national security perspective. Now, we might then ask, okay, so is that likely to happen, that level of projection of force? I think it helps to ask first, well, how does it all look from the perspective of cartel leadership? How might their strategic decision-making be conceived? Their core goals, what are they? Making money, maximizing their own liberty, minimizing the threat, whether from the Mexican state or from cooperating other states like the United States, or from rival cartels, to their liberty and their security, and trying to keep open the space for the business they're trying to conduct. That's generally true for most of them. La Familia Michoacan is arguably a little bit, or was, there's some question about what's happening with La Familia today, but it's arguably a little bit different on this dimension. It has ideological dimensions. Some of its rhetoric and propaganda almost looked Taliban-esque in terms of talking about bringing this sort of a combination of patriotism and religious theology that suggests that there's something more going on here than just making money, but setting them aside, that's their basic aim. And what strategies would follow from a leadership perspective? Well, certainly vis-a-vis the United States, the goal would be, while resisting any efforts by the United States to suppress their activities, not going overboard to the point of precipitating a reaction that will actually be bad for business. And that suggests that from a strategic perspective, the cartels would want to check themselves at some point. But that's not enough to ensure that you will not end up with projection of strategically significant power to the United States for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not as if the cartel's top-level strategic decision-making can be guaranteed to be complied with all the way down through the organization. In any organization, there's a problem of seeing through at the line level that strategic priorities are being implemented, far more so in clandestine, private networks that operate in a pervasively insecure operational environment. There's bound to be a lot of slippage between what's strategically wise for the group and what 19, 17, 14-year-olds with guns are doing at the field. It may be that the attack on the ICE agents is an example of this sort of slippage between what's in the cartel's strategic interests and what people actually do in the field. Similarly, exacerbating that problem is something that Vanda Velba Brown at Brookings, who writes well on these issues, recently was just talking about. Her critique of the Calderon administration's strategy is that it tried for decapitation of top-level leadership while failing to account for the need to simultaneously sideline the mid-tier leadership that will then fill in that vacuum. She suggests, in effect, that the top of the snake is being cut off, but nothing's being done to prevent all the fighting from the next tier of leadership that emerges. Insofar as the decapitation strategy has been undertaken by the Calderon administration, it facilitates this slippage between what's strategically smart for the organization to be doing and how much control you exercise over your own people. Now, the other possibility for a real change in the strategic climate, and this would be the really worst-case scenario we'd have to watch for, would be a decision by one or more of the cartels to adopt a top-down strategic change where they actually affirmatively do try to bring the U.S. in. Why would they possibly want to do this? Well, can anyone tell me a reason why they might want to do this in a worst-case scenario? Or is it inconceivable that they would try it? Imagine a circumstance. Try to get the U.S. to go in, maybe even boots on the ground. How, in what way could that possibly redound to their benefit?
Create chaos with our political system.
You would certainly have chaos. What might you be able to play that?
The Mexican state?
Sorry?
It undermines the Mexican state?
It would certainly make the Mexican state would have quite a quandary, because having anything resembling, the more boots on the ground like presence the United States might have in Mexico, the more we have the problem of Mexican nationalism raising a problem for the Mexican state.
Yeah, I guess, Bobby, the problem I have with your proposal is it's inconceivable to me politically in Mexico that any leader from any of the three parties.
Oh, absolutely.
Introducing U.S.
Absolutely. And so what I'm suggesting is that, is there a scenario in which a cartel would try to do something to provoke the United States to come in, regardless of what the Mexican state, because the Mexican state is not going to tolerate this if it has any possible choice.
But they don't want to disrupt their market.
Well, they don't want to disrupt their market. So what would the circumstance have to be? It would have to therefore be a cartel that was at its grasping for its last straw before going out of business, which is what I'm suggesting is the one scenario that I think is at all plausible where something like this could happen. That's the scenario we've got to watch out for.
So that would be Michel Accord in terms of what we think right now.
You know, the fortunate thing for us, I suppose, is that Michoacan geographically is not in a position to execute such a strategy, even if they were to decide they wanted to do this. If Juarez, if Gulf, Sinaloa, one of these others, especially Sinaloa, if for some reason the political fallout from the next election somehow sidelines them, but not anyone else, again, this is far-fetched, but I'm suggesting the entire scenario of the cartels becoming that strategically significant for us, the whole thing's far-fetched. But this is a scenario where it could happen, and that's what you'd want to really police for. Now, I've probably gone on too long, so why don't I just stop there?
Fascinating, Bobby. Thank you very much. That was great. And you'll have plenty of time to ask questions too. So now let me move on to Greg Thrash with the Drug Enforcement Administration.
Thank you, Celeste. I just want to say on behalf of DEA, I'm extremely honored to be here and very humbled in the company that I'm in. I do want to acknowledge my colleagues within the Austin Police Department who we have developed a phenomenal relationship with. Chief Carter, newly elected Commander Baker, and Chief Mannix was here a minute ago. But I want to acknowledge you guys and thanks for being here. We were asked to come and give you guys, from our perspective, I've heard a lot of great things today. I've been studying the cartels and have been in this business for 24 years, 25 in law enforcement. I worked in Florida for quite a while during the 80s and the early 90s when the Colombians were in power. I moved back to Texas, South Texas in 2000. Was gone for about a 6-7 year period from Texas. I was overseas and in Washington. And while I was gone is when we saw some phenomenal changes in the drug world, whereas we had Mexico enter the world in such a way that we had never seen before. But just a little bit about what our mission is real quick, and then we're going to move on into what we believe are the problems, why we got to where we are, what we think some of the policy implications can be. DEA's mission, we're worldwide, a federal agency, we're worldwide. We have offices in 82 different foreign cities. The globalization issue was mentioned many times today, and many times we've asked the question in DEA, should we have offices in China, which we do? Should we have offices in Hong Kong, which we do? Should we not take those resources and put them into Mexico? That's been considered. We've all asked those questions. But the globalization, and I think we hit it on the head this morning with what everyone was saying, we can't move out of those areas. We move out of that area and we create a vacuum. But nonetheless, 82 different foreign cities. We're in over 200 offices around the United States. And we've got 11 offices, or 11 DEA offices around the country of Mexico. We've got 2,000 southwest border miles, 1,200 of them in Texas alone, 600 miles of what really affects us here in Austin. And I want to try to, I was backing away and doing more of a regional, global approach, but I'm going to focus more on what's happening here in Austin. But 600 miles, or 30% of the border, really affects what's going on here with the trafficking patterns that we in law enforcement see. What I mean by that is from Brownsville all the way up to around Acuna, Del Rio, is where the majority of our trafficking patterns come from into Austin. We're going to get into how Austin's being used in a moment. Juarez, El Paso, phenomenal corridor, battled by the Sinaloa and Juarez group. Sinaloa, probably the most powerful criminal organization in the world. But nonetheless, those 600 miles are controlled primarily by the Gulf Cartel, the Los Zetas, and La Familia is playing a big role, which you'll see here in a moment, within the city of Austin in our area. I borrowed this from Stratford, local intelligence crew here in Austin, just to show you the significance of Mexico. I don't even think I need to do that after what we've heard today. But the significance of Mexico within the realm of the drug world today. They control, well, we'll get into that in a moment. Here's what the structure is at this point. What we see it from DEA's perspective and from what we glean from our informants, from our intelligence, from our intercepts, and so forth. Over on the left, we've got the Tijuana, or the old Arellano Felix organization. They're arguably even a cartel anymore, but they're still, they still deserve mention. The Juarez Cartel, the Los Zetas Gulf Cartel, the Sinaloa Federation is what they're being called today, La Familia, and then there's some new remnants and splinter groups from the old Beltran Leyva that had moved over and kind of formed their own DTO, and they're calling themselves the Pacific Cartel. I put them in red because DEA is really not recognizing them as a formal cartel at this point in time. There is some question within our own agency, is La Familia an actual major DTO threat to be reckoned with on an international level? I argue that they are. I think our colleagues in Atlanta and Dallas and other places where the hubs are hot in those areas will argue that as well. La Familia is on the ropes. That is one of the cartels that Mexico, the government of Mexico, is going after. I think it was Dr. Hazen earlier said that the biggest organized crime threat in the world today are the cartels. At least I think that's what I heard. I believe that. We believe that. We believe it is the most powerful criminal organization in the world, particularly obviously from a drug enforcement perspective. They control almost all of the U.S. market, from the entry, from the smuggling from the border, to the distribution outlets. And I'll show you in a moment how they have just bursted over the years. 90% of all the cocaine is attributed to Mexico, 80% of all the methamphetamine, and there are major rising heroin production in recent years in Mexico. Okay, I say they're the most powerful organization in the world. I believe, and we believe in DEA, the most powerful organization, even more so than the old mafia, and that was brought up earlier, and I'd like to address that issue with money in a moment. But the reasons that they are so powerful is they are experts at creating routes. They've got vast routes and smuggling routes throughout the country. They've become experts at just expansion, at going into cities and going into the areas that we traditionally wouldn't think there'd be any cartel activity or any major DTO activity. We've got them documented in over 230 United States cities. And when I say them, it's all the cartels combined. They are experts at smuggling. And I didn't throw a lot of pictures in here, but I wanted to give you an idea of how expert they are, how they'll resort to any means to get that stuff into the country, through tunnels, through false compartments in vehicles, through false compartments in trailers, any way they can get it in. In fact, just 2 weeks ago in Round Rock, there was a car stopped by the Round Rock Police Department. Officer was suspicious, did his diligence. There was 30 kilos of cocaine found inside the gas tank. Now, we see false gas tanks all the time, but what we don't see is the kilos of cocaine submerged, floating within the gasoline. That's unusual. That just happened 2 weeks ago. They will resort to any means. Secondly, their advanced communications technology. We heard a lot about cyber stuff today, and let me tell you, we are all way behind the curve in law enforcement, but the cartels are not. The telephone technology that they're using today is second to none, using the Nextels, the push-to-talks. The way they do business is buy a box of phones, put them in a bag. They'll use one today, one tomorrow, and it's very difficult for law enforcement to keep up. The two-way radio networks, they've got a phenomenal network set up along the border and all the way down into past Monterey at this point. IT, the Skype, RIM technology, and social media. Dr. Chang mentioned today there's 25 billion tweets a day, I think is what I heard. 600 million Facebook users. And these guys are using every bit of it. The compartmentalization of the cartels today, and we're seeing that here even in investigations in Austin, to where the command and control of the organization is being done in Mexico. From Mexico, they're just calling the shots to their cell heads in Austin, to their cell heads in Houston, Atlanta, and Dallas. That cell head in Austin doesn't know what's going on in Dallas. Mexico does. This cell head in Austin may never know what's going on in Dallas, except that he's told to go there, pick up a load, and take it somewhere else. Or accept a load in Austin, take the load from Austin to Atlanta, or so on and so forth. Their compartmentalization is expert. They become experts at it. And obviously, their tactics of intimidation. I believe the beheadings and the hangings of the bodies and all the mutilations that we're seeing are nothing more than terroristic tactics that they're using to keep their own people under control, as well as sending messages to others, including the government of Mexico. And obviously, the repatriation of currency is what keeps these guys in business. It's what keeps this thing running. I heard the GDP of Mexico, if I'm not mistaken, is roughly 250 billion. And these guys are moving. We have estimated anywhere from 15 to 25 billion going down in bulk cash. I've seen estimates. I think I saw an estimate today of 40 billion. I've seen estimates of up to 49 billion. I think this is a conservative estimate, 15 to 25 billion dollars. I did want to comment on, I think, Admiral Inman, it was your question of why can't we track the money the way we did the mafia? The IRS got involved when we took down Capone and those guys. I think the difference here is, and Dr. Hazen mentioned it, I think she mentioned an army of ants. That's what we're seeing, an army of ants moving this cash out of here. It doesn't stay here. Once it gets into Mexico, we don't really know what happens to it. I hate to say that. There is a black hole once it gets into the Mexican system or crosses the border into Mexico. We're not seeing the black market peso exchange like we saw in the 1970s and 80s and even into the 90s that the Colombians used to move their money. We're seeing this money go south in suitcases and false compartments, strapped on people's bodies. Any way they can get it across and into Mexico, they do. Once it gets there, we're really not sure what's happening to the money. All right. What caused the rise of the cartels? And we use that word so freely anymore, but the major DTOs in Mexico, what caused Mexico to become what it is today? And there's several reasons. I said that I had worked in Florida during the days of the Colombians. When I moved back to Texas, things had completely changed. When I was in Florida, everything came into Miami, up I-95, and out throughout the country. Nowadays, the drugs are coming in through Mexico into Texas and Arizona, but mainly Texas, and going to Florida. Now they're going from here to Miami. Why the rise of the cartels? Colombia's been mentioned a couple of times today, but we can't underestimate the importance of what happened in Colombia from a law enforcement perspective to what happened in Mexico. And we'll get into smuggling routes, their knowledge of the border and knowledge of U.S., the Mexican knowledge. The political climate in Mexico had a lot to do with this, which created an upset in the balance of power, and of course, the armament and the training that the cartels have today. So let's look at the Colombian cartels real briefly. We could start with Carlos Later, Pablo Escobar. We've all heard those names. If you ever saw the movie Blow with Johnny Depp, it was a movie, it was Hollywood's version, but it was somewhat accurate as to how the Medellin cartel got started and how they flooded the United States with cocaine. Later hooked up with some people that he was actually in a U.S. prison with. They started bringing in kilos of cocaine from Colombia in suitcases of 10 to 20 at a time. He started having such a market that they then began to utilize large airplanes. He then bought an island out near the Bahamas, Norman's Key, and was able to start using it as a transshipment point and a refueling transit point for his airplanes, that he was just flooding the United States with cocaine. This was the start of the 100, 200, 300 kilogram of cocaine that we started to see in the late 70s and early 80s. So the Medellin cartel started this thing. They started to get very big, started to get very strong and powerful. But Colombia is not Mexico. And the Colombian system is not Mexico. And there's a lot of political aspects we could get into, but what the mistake that they did versus, and I think it was Dr. Hayes as well, said that the cartels like to fly under the radar. Well, the Medellin cartel wasn't flying under the radar. You had Carlos Later that had tried to win public office. You had Pablo Escobar, if I'm not mistaken, had considered a run for office. They essentially flew above the radar, and they essentially took on the government of Colombia. That led to the Medellin cartel's demise. And as they were taking on the government, another group came in called the Cali cartel, and they started to become more businesslike. They dressed in coat and ties. They did business as a true businessman did. Therefore, they started to take over the worldwide cocaine trade as the Medellin group was on its demise. And if you recall, Pablo Escobar was on the run. We used some U.S. assets in order to apprehend him in 93. But as all that was going on, Medellin was out, Cali cartel started to make their rise, and they realized we don't want the same problems that the Medellin bunch had. So they started to strike deals with the U.S., they started to strike deals with the prosecutors in Colombia, and they started to just back away and just dissolve themselves in a sense. Well, what happened is then during about this time, they started utilizing Mexico. Now we're into the 90s, mid-90s or so. Now Mexico was always smuggling things into the United States, have been forever. But Mexico started to be used as from a smaller perspective, as a transit point for Colombian cocaine. Colombia would give the Mexicans some cocaine, and they would sell it and then pay back the Colombians, or the Mexicans would be paid with a load of some sort. But essentially what was happening is Colombia was still utilizing their networks around the United States for distribution outlets. They were just using the Mexicans to get it into the United States. Smuggle it into Mexico, smuggle it into the United States, Mexicans are out of it, now the Colombians are in it. Well, the Colombians got smart because they were exposing themselves in all the major cities. They had outlets with Colombian outlets in New York and Florida, all over the United States, Dominican outlets. Well, they got smart and they said, Mexico, why don't you take it all? You take it all. We'll get it into Mexico and it's yours. That's what I showed you earlier, the explosion or the expansion of the Mexican distribution outlets around the country. They Colombia's utilized in vessels, they're utilized in large airplanes and so forth, just to get major amounts of cocaine into Mexico. Let me go back. Mexico, since this time and since that time and all the way up to the present, has then taken their expertise of smuggling, their expertise of creating networks, and now they've got distribution outlets that they control. Not the Haitians, although there are those organizations, but they control it from start to finish. This all happened in a matter of approximately 15 years. Then obviously another reason the cartels got so powerful is the PRI had been in power, and I'm not a politician, I'm not a student of politics, just know what we've read and those that we have debriefed, is that once the PRI was ousted when Fox got elected in 2000, the PRI had been in power, I believe, for 70 years. Corruption has always been Mexico's Achilles heel. Corruption was complicit within the PRI. It was like a turn a blind eye. It was a good old boy system. Fox came in. Not a lot changed, although he was with a different political party, but things did start to turn around. A democracy in its own way started to emerge. Then what happened in 2006? We all know what happened then when Calderon was elected. And then things really started to change, not just with violence, but with the cartel's continued growth and their structuring. So that was a major reason why they were able to grow so fast. And then all of this actually contributed to a balance of power upset within the cartels themselves, which led to the development and obviously the induced violence, which we've heard so much about, roughly, 35,000 deaths since that time. I won't go into that. Now, the current alignment, which is why one of the reasons we are seeing so much violence, Dr. Ainsley hit on it very well this morning and said that it's layered and it's very, very complex. It's not just Juarez versus Sinaloa. It's a lot more complex than that, but in a simple sense, in a general sense, this is what you've got. What affects us more than anything, obviously, is what's going on from Laredo down to Brownsville with the Gulf Cartel, La Familia and the Sinaloa, which they called themselves now the new federation, in battling with the Los Zetas. Then up in the other one, which we've heard so much of today in the Juarez, El Paso area, the Juarez cartel and the Zetas teamed up versus the Sinaloa. And then you've got some splinter groups like the one I mentioned, the Pacific group and the old Beltran Leyva, that they go, they really have gone both ways, we've seen. All right, real quick, I was asked to just throw out some policy, and what do we think needs to be done from our perspective? We certainly can't sit here and say we need to change U.S. policy, but we do, from law enforcement, need to have a strong, aggressive alliance with Mexico. We got to have that. We had that in Colombia. The Plan Colombia that has been talked about earlier today was effective to some degree, and it was effective for a lot of reasons, one of which was the time was ripe for the cartels to do what they did. We didn't and I also heard today that the same amount of cocaine is still getting into the United States, maybe more. So we just leveled that thing out, is what we did. But we did actually dismantle and disrupt and contain to some degree through the strong aggressive alliance with Mexico, with Colombia. But needed to have some sort of that same plan today, strong and aggressive stance, politically, economically, from a police standpoint, and militarily. And secondly, an aggressive education. I heard it say today, we've got to educate the people, our young people, about the drug use. We're not doing a good job of that today in the United States. Modification to regulation, and let me clarify that, or modernization. I even heard that term earlier. For our job, and anybody in law enforcement that has worked drug trafficking organizations knows that it's a tough job. Not because of the people we're dealing with, not because it's so stressful, it's hard to convict, it's hard to make these cases work. It's hard because these crooks are so smart, because they're doing different things and so forth. What I mean by modernization or modification to the regulation is we're still up at wiretapping. In fact, Tony Plohetsky wrote an article the other day in the Statesman about federal wiretapping. The wiretap laws were written in the 70s, and we're still operating under those same guidelines. And we've got technology today where you can walk in and buy a box of phones at Walmart and register them in Mickey Mouse, for real, and we see that every day. And lastly, what we need is a strong rule of law in the United States. And let me segue into this. All right, is this a trend or an anomaly? Here, and I'm not saying this is all a result of the cartel activity. I'm not saying it's a result of what's going on in Mexico. But this is facts are the facts. And I'll just leave it up. Is it a trend or is this just the way it is? The 2011 has been, the start of 2011 is the most deadliest year for law enforcement. According to the National Law Enforcement Memorial, we've got a 53% increase of law enforcement officers that are being killed by gunfire, not being hit while they're on a traffic stop, not being stabbed while at a domestic disturbance, but shot by gunfire. Now, I don't know the percentage of what are involved with in drug-related, but 53% increase. That's 48% of all the fatalities in law enforcement up to Monday were as a result of gunfire. Now, I mentioned that, and it's funny that Congressman McCaul mentioned the word game changer. I didn't take that from him, and he didn't take it from me. But 1985, Enrique Camarena, a DEA agent assigned to Guadalajara, Mexico, was kidnapped by they called themselves the Guadalajara cartel at the time. He was kidnapped, subsequently tortured, and he was murdered. That triggered an enormous response from the United States government, phenomenal response. The borders were shut down. Everything broke loose in Mexico and the United States. There was nothing we wouldn't do to go after those that did it, including those high up in the government of Mexico at the time. As a result of this, the Mexican traffickers realized, and we know this for a fact, the Mexican traffickers realized the United States is not going to stand for an attack on a law enforcement officer. They're not going to stand for it. Look at what they did. They disrupted our business. They disrupted this. They disrupted that. They're not going to stand for it. Law enforcement, you United States agents, you guys are off limits. Let me give you an example, a real live example of this. In 1999, a friend of mine, Joe Dubois, he's an agent with DEA, signed to Monterey. He was in Matamoros doing some work. He was in a car with diplomatic tags. Had somebody with him, and an FBI agent with him, and then somebody else. The same scenario that Congressman McCaul mentioned earlier began to happen to this DEA agent. Car in front, car in back. Finally, they blocked him in. Got out, AK-47s, the exact scenario. He cracked his window just a little bit. Hey, I'm a DEA agent on assignment, blah, blah, blah. Get out of the car. The thing that saved this agent is that he was a fluent Spanish speaker, native Spanish speaker. He ended up talking to Alciel Cardenas at the time, who was a high-level member, or actually was the leader of the Gulf Cartel at the time. They had been tracking these agents for some time. Nonetheless, ordered them out of the car, wouldn't get out. They were in an armored car. Alciel then ordered the guys to start firing. The agent told Alciel at the time, he says, you know what will happen. Remember Kiki Camarena. And Alciel shook his head, ordered the guys away. That happened in 1999. If that were to happen today, I think that DEA agent would have been dead. And it's exactly what we just saw happen in Mexico not about a month ago. The reason I mention these two things is the rule of law. I believe our founding fathers knew best, but the rule of law is absolutely paramount in the United States to quell these kind of things. I'm not saying a tyrannical regime, but the people know that if you break the law, there will be consequences to pay. No doubt about it. The United States government is not going to take lightly you killing an American agent in the United States or in Mexico or anywhere else. With that, I just wanted to finish with a couple of things that are going on in Austin, what we have been able to do, the successes that we've had. We've heard doom and gloom all day to some degree, but there is no problem with connecting the dots as far as drug intelligence in Austin. In partnership with the Austin Police Department and the FBI and the ATF and multiple others, U.S. Marshals and multiple other local agencies, we've created a coalition or task force here in Austin that's second to none. We're sitting under one building, we share intelligence daily, we work cases together daily, and we are literally attacking these cartels in Austin here. There's command and control cells here in Austin that are running things all around the country. We know that. I can promise you this, we are on top of it. And I just commend all the agencies that are a part of that. So with that, I will turn it over to Celeste.
Greg, thank you very much. That was great, Greg. Thank you so much. Okay, let me just move on to Michael Reyes.
Good afternoon. My bio is not in the package. I think Celeste was even surprised to see me show up today. I've been traveling quite a bit, and I didn't get my information in. So I'll start with a little bit of background about who I am. I'm the resident agent in charge for ATF here in Austin. We cover 30 counties out of Austin. I've been an ATF agent since 1992. Prior to that, I was an INS special agent, so I like the controversial areas of law enforcement. I don't think you get two more hotter topics than immigration and guns. I didn't realize that at the time when I switched agencies. I've been in Austin since 2005. Prior to that, I was the resident agent in charge down in McAllen with about a 2-year break when I had to go do my time in D.C. I got my start in federal law enforcement in Los Angeles, where I was out there for 10 years. So you take a small West Texas boy and you throw him into L.A., and I lost my mind for a little while. I don't have a PowerPoint. The cybersecurity stuff really scares me, so I'm going to do mine analog instead of digital. I'll start with, first of all, by thanking Greg for throwing up the the geographic areas of coverage. I think Hector's in the same position we are, is that we cover the same geographic area. And you'll find that throughout the United States for the most part at the field office level, where all the offices share the same area, which makes coordination of our cases with each other a lot easier. I will also start with just a brief discussion of the gun laws in Texas or in the United States and compare those with the gun laws in Mexico. We've all heard that Mexico has extremely strict, restrictive gun laws. The United States gun laws are based on the Gun Control Act of 1968 and the National Firearms Act of 1934. The 1934 law basically regulates machine guns. It was after Prohibition when all the Tommy guns were going crazy and the short-barreled shotguns. So it's your short-barreled shotguns, your machine guns, your destructive devices, and basically the law states that it's okay for you to have any of those items as long as you register them. And part of the registration is paying your $200 tax, getting fingerprinted, and making sure you pass a background check. The Gun Control Act looks at all other guns other than those required to be registered under the National Firearms Act. And the main portion of that is the regulation of the gun industry, along with addressing primarily the prohibiting factors of who can and cannot possess firearms. That's where you get your felon in possession, your illegal alien in possession, those individuals who buy guns for other people. And in general, it's completely legal for you as long as you're not in one of the 10 prohibited groups to possess a firearm. Now, the carrying of a firearm becomes a state issue and not a federal issue. We get those calls all the time, can I have my gun with me? And that's strictly a state issue, and it varies state by state. In Mexico, the guns that you can possess down there as a citizen are those 38 Super, the caliber 38 Super or less. Anything above that, which would include 9mm and above, is reserved for the exclusive use of the military. So if you're not military, you can't have those guns. It is illegal for you to possess those guns unless they are well, you can't even possess the 9mm and above. The 22s and anything 38 Super and below, you can have them if they're registered. So you have to go through the registration process, and you can, in fact, possess those guns down there. Looking at getting guns in the United States compared to getting guns in Mexico, Mexico has one gun store in the country. It is run by the military, and it is at the military base. If you want to get a firearm in Mexico, you submit the paperwork, kind of like what you would have to do under the National Firearms Act for a machine gun. You submit the paperwork. Takes about a week to go through the process. You have to do the application. Your employer has to file an application as well on your behalf, I guess vouching for you. The forms are sent to the military. The gun store, I think right now, is run by a lieutenant colonel in the military. If they approve you to get the firearm, you then travel to Mexico City, where you give your fingerprints up, and the information is entered into an electronic database, so they know who possesses the guns or who bought the guns. In comparison, in the United States, as of 2010, and these numbers vary daily because people surrendering their licenses, in the United States, there's just under 119,000 federal firearms registered gun dealers. These are individuals who have put in a license request and an application and have received a federal firearms license. Now, that includes your collectors, your pawn shops, and then your regular stores like McBride's Academy and the like. Cutting that down into Texas, we have about 8,500 in Texas, licensed gun dealers. Texas is divided into two geographic areas for ATF. We're out of the Houston Field Division. So you take basically Texas, you cut it in half, and then cut down towards Del Rio. It's considered the Houston Field Division. And in the Houston Field Division, we have about 4,500 gun dealers. So it tells you the volume of gun dealers. Now, most of these gun dealers, or a large majority of these gun dealers, are at-home gun dealers who really may not sell more than 2 or 3 guns a year. A lot of them get their gun license. They're collectors themselves, and it's easier for them to order from wholesalers rather than to have to go to a regular gun store. So not all 4,500 are actively selling and dealing in firearms. Under Texas law, under federal law, as I mentioned, anybody can possess a firearm as long as you're not prohibited. In acquiring a firearm, you have two ways of doing it. You can go through a gun store where you would do the 4473, the ATF form, where it indicates several of the factors, and it's an application. You fill it out. The information, your driver's license, social security number is called in to the FBI, and the instant check is done, and you can walk out of there, generally out of a gun store, within 30 minutes with your firearm. Another way to get it is if I decide I have a particular firearm that I no longer want and my friend Hector wants to buy it, there's nothing wrong with me selling it to Hector. The only prohibition on that would be if I know that Hector has been in prison or is a prohibited person, then I cannot sell him that firearm. But it is incumbent on law enforcement to develop the information that would clearly prove to a jury that I knew that he was prohibited from possessing a firearm. So I've always got the deniability. I did not know that Hector was prohibited and could not possess one. So that's kind of basically the firearms on the acquisition of the firearms and the availability of them. As far as programs, we'll touch on several, and again, I think the three of us here at the end decided that we would really open it up to question and answer, so we're going to keep our presentations a little bit short. Programs that we're doing involving firearms trafficking, which is one of the major things that we're looking at ATF, are in conjunction with the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the Don't Lie for the Other Guy, where we're looking at educating, having gun stores educated and have them educate others on straw purchasing. Straw purchasing is nothing more than someone going in and buying a gun for someone else. They're not the intended purchaser of the gun or the possessor of it. And then our big project is Operation Gun Runner, where we're specifically targeting guns into Mexico. I'll get back to Gun Runner here in just a minute, but at first I want to put Chief Carter, throw the mic over to him and have him discuss one of the main things, and Greg touched on it, and I think Hector will too, is the cooperation. The three of us are here in Austin, so we deal more specifically with Austin and the 35 corridor. And I think all of us understand, and I know there's some deputies from Travis County in the room and DPS. I'd like him to touch on the cooperation between law enforcement, if you don't mind, Chief.
Sure, Michael. Thank you. Just kind of a little bit of background on American law enforcement that we recognize here in Austin and also with all our partners here, which we do have DPS, the state, the county, as well as Chief Dahlstrom back here from University of Texas Police Department. One thing we know that ever since 9/11, that law enforcement has a big stake in the issue of not only in counterterrorism issues, but trying to get our hands around issues of organized crime groups that are growing, transnational gangs such as the cartels, and looking at whatever the effects are on the Austin area and also working with our partners. I really appreciate these gentlemen that are up here on this panel, and I think we can safely say that in Austin we actually have a good experiment going on in terms of this collaboration. We recognize that each, whether it's local, state, or federal, each entity has certain responsibility and has certain information that may help solve problems. Once again, ever since 9/11, we recognize the issue that information about specific terrorists existed in law enforcement somewhere, but the problem was the issue of, number one, sharing information, and probably more importantly, sharing intelligence. Difference between intelligence, criminal intelligence for our part, and information is that it's undergone some form of analysis. We also have some folks here from the Austin Regional Intelligence Center that we're very proud of our analysts and detectives that work in that arena. So something's going on here in Austin that I think is important for people to know. We just opened the Austin Regional Intelligence Center actually at the end of last year, and it's still going through some of the development phases right now in terms of technology and software. And I think it's safe to say, and I don't think Admiral Inman will hate me for this, that I did have a conversation with the Admiral about the issue of intelligence versus criminal intelligence, looking at how people perceive that, issues of civil liberties and so forth, and that was probably about 3 years ago when we started this project. But it's important to remember that law enforcement in the United States is decentralized. Our founding fathers basically wanted a somewhat weak law enforcement system because really they didn't want a police state. So we developed it, the Constitution, law enforcement, again, being very decentralized. What we realized, the problem with that system today is that you have silos of information that exist all over this country. And one of the challenges for law enforcement is to figure out ways to better communicate amongst themselves. And again, I'm very proud of the group here representing all the departments and agencies here in Austin. We've committed to become a national model in terms of how to figure out how to share information. If there's information that we get, and I think people are becoming familiar with the idea of community policing, whether you're talking about counter-radicalization of Muslim youth, or you're talking about drug cartels reaching into our major cities such as Austin and developing drug runners, reaching out into street-level gangs, prison gangs. We recognize that all of those things are going on, and we have to come together to share the intelligence so that we each can work together and capitalize on those precious taxpayer dollars that we have now. So we have a lot of challenges here in law enforcement, as all of these gentlemen do. And I just want to thank Michael, Greg, and Hector, and all of our partners as we move forward with this project, the Austin Regional Intelligence Center. I think you'll see some really good work. We've worked with Dr. Lauderdale in terms of also some other interesting projects. We're just getting a big grant. I won't talk too much about it, but really it goes to the issue almost like counter-radicalization, but focusing on youth gangs that may be being developed by folks from the drug cartels. And we'll talk more about that in the future, but I'll leave it at that.
And I'd like to echo what Chief Carter was saying about the cooperation here in Austin. This is the 5th office that I've worked in, and the cooperation. I can pick up the phone. I think these two gentlemen will agree with me. We can pick up the phone and get Chief Carter or Chief Acevedo or any of the commanders or assistant chiefs on the phone to discuss whatever issue we need. So it's a pleasure to have that sort of working cooperation with all the law enforcement agencies here in Austin. I'll get back to Project Gunrunner and explain a little bit of what that project is all about. Project Gunrunner was looking at, it was a project that was instituted, started here in the Houston Field Division, where we started specifically looking at gun trafficking cells, taking guns into Mexico. And in working with our DEA counterparts, we were able to look at the smuggling trends and corridors that they used over at DEA that they had identified and really just turn those things in reverse. They use almost the same routes coming up as going back. It is decompartmentalized, so the individuals bringing the drugs up are not the same ones taking the guns south, but the corridors are the same, and the organizations are still the same organizations. In looking at that, what we started doing was sending agents and our inspectors to gun stores to start looking at and identifying who was buying guns from gun dealers. We started looking at gun shows. We did that pretty aggressively here in Austin, and I'll discuss that on policy implications. And we're basically looking at doing gun traces on guns recovered at crime scenes to identify who is buying these guns. And what we're finding on these straw purchasers is these organizations will identify a person whom they want to put in charge of their firearms acquisitions. That person on his own will go out and find individuals and pay them anywhere between $50 to $200 to go to a gun store and buy 2 or 3 guns. There's no limit on the amount of guns you can buy. If you're buying handguns, if you buy 5 or more handguns within a 5-day period, the gun store is required to submit a form to ATF saying Hector went in and bought 5 guns over the last 3 days, and we just thought you should have this information. That requirement is not there for long guns, for rifles. So any individual can go in and buy as many 223 firearm or any kind of rifle and not have to, the gun dealer does not have to notify ATF. So what happens is these individuals who are running the gun trafficking cell will gather the guns. When they get a shipment large enough to send south, they'll put the shipment together and send it south. We've identified several of those groups here in Austin, which was a surprise to me, having worked in McAllen for 4.5 years, to see probably more of that up here in Austin than right there on the border. And I think that's because they realize that there's a limited number of gun stores in that area, and it's easier to spread out throughout the state, get the guns, bring them to a central location, package them up, and then send them south. The smuggling routes are the same. The methods they use are breaking them down into parts, sending them down as car parts, hiding them in whatever trailers are going south. So it's basically anything they would use to get the drugs, they'll use the same tactics to get them south. The Gun Runner project was taken nationwide after the success here in the Houston division was seen. And from about 2006, I'll throw you some numbers out. As of January 27th, currently in the U.S., there's about 4,600 open investigations under Project Gun Runner. These are individual investigations looking at a particular organization, so or cell that's putting the guns together. So that gives you kind of an idea of how many of these types of cases there are. Since 2006, and this is covering up until 2010, ATF has recovered about 10,000 firearms and a little over 1.5 million rounds of ammunition. Ammunition under federal law falls into the same category as a firearm. So if you're a felon and you're found in possession of nothing more than ammunition, it is still against the law. It's the same as possessing the firearm. So that's where we really get to work with our local partners because that is not the case under Texas state law. There are currently 809 defendants serving an average of 104 months in federal prison for gun trafficking, and about 300 defendants who are still awaiting sentencing. One of the things I now mentioned, tracing, that's one of the methods in which we use to identify these groups, and that's where the issue with Mexico particularly comes in, is the tracing of the firearms. And in order to conduct the full trace, you have to have all the information on the firearm, and that's, we have special agents who've been on for several years who still have difficulty getting the information right when they do these traces. So that is one of the obstacles that we're looking at and having to work with, and we'll talk about that on implications as well. One of the major partners in our firearms trafficking and our gun runner are the gun dealers themselves. They, for the most part, the gun dealers are very cooperative with us and are doing their part. I don't want to leave the impression that the gun dealers are the problem. For the most part, they're self-regulating, self-compliant with the regulations. They don't want to lose their businesses for the most part. We do have some investigations that targeted gun dealers, but those gun dealers are, they're not your brick and mortar stores anyway. I'll look a little bit at policy implications, and I mentioned I don't think that there is a hotter topic than gun rights. And anytime anyone starts talking about gun laws, you're on very touchy ground, and that is one of the primary problems we're having. One of the earlier presenters was talking about the percentages that were used, and I think one of our deputy director got into some hot water and some issues over the number of guns recovered in Mexico on a percentage. So anytime we start talking about numbers and anything dealing with guns, I read a report, I think it's been about a month ago, that said, it was an editorial where someone was saying that, well, since we don't know how many were recovered in Mexico were from the U.S., then we cannot say that the guns are coming from the United States. I can tell you from a law enforcement side, a vast majority of the guns in Mexico are coming from the U.S. and in particular, Texas. So the guns are going from Texas down south. While we're doing these types of investigations, the organizations themselves get smart. They know we're targeting guns going south, and they know they can go elsewhere to get the guns. An earlier presenter mentioned about the hand grenades coming from either Mexican stockpile or from other countries in Central America, and that's what's happening with the guns as well. So there are guns coming from other countries that we're getting information on and intelligence on. I mentioned the trace data, the difficulty with trace. A lot of numbers have been thrown out, so I've seen all kinds of ranges on the guns recovered in Mexico. My understanding is about 40% of the gun traces submitted by Mexico were able to be completed. What we've done is we've taken our trace system and our electronic trace system and converted it into Spanish for the authorities in Mexico to use. They enter their own data into it, so that makes it somewhat problematic as well. Admiral Inman mentioned earlier the privacy issues, and I don't think privacy issues are any more complex than they are when you start talking about gun ownership. There is no national registry, and I have police officers call the office all the time asking me, or private citizens saying, you know, my house was broken into, is there any way you can give me the serial number? And they're shocked and amazed when I tell them there is no way for me to do that. There is no registration of firearms other than those machine guns and firearms that fall under the National Firearms Act. So the only way to get that information is from the gun dealer. They're the ones required to keep the paperwork. And I think one of the biggest policy implications on working this, and the three of us up here are not policymakers. We're not. I don't think we often get called on by our agency to give our thoughts, but I'll give some here now, because y'all are my friends and this isn't going anywhere. It might shock everyone in this room to know, especially those in law enforcement, that one of the biggest problems we have is budgets. Our budgetary process in the federal government, it was mentioned earlier by Congressman McCaul, we still don't have a budget. So that impacts all of us up here in the law enforcement side too. When you start talking about government shutdowns, that affects all of us. Now they don't shut down the essential personnel, and I don't know how we fell into it, but I think all three of us are in that essential personnel, but all our support personnel are out the door should we have a government shutdown. So that's some of the implications of not having a budget and what that does to us. And that's all I have, and I'll turn it back.
Fantastic. Oh, great, Michael, that was great. Thank you so much. Okay, let's turn now to, sorry. Now to Hector Gomez with the U.S. Marshal Service. Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. Again, my name is Hector Gomez, and I'm the supervisor here with the U.S. Marshal Service in Austin. I'll be able to give you, we'll go back in history just for a few minutes, but one thing I find fascinating is, you know, if Matt Dillon were here today in 2011 and kind of looked at the agency and what we do now, he wouldn't believe, you know, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Iraq, you know, what is this witness security program? So the agency has evolved as it was created in 1789, the oldest law enforcement agency. We're a very versatile agency, but we've also had our peaks and valleys. And I'll go into some little detail about that, but to give you tell you a little bit about myself, I came into the agency in '86 and was in Brownsville, McAllen, and Denver, and finally got back here to Austin home in '94. I've seen a lot of changes. I can remember when I came in 1986, we had the occasional bank robber, white-collar crime, an occasional gun case. And, you know, judges spent very little time on the bench. And now where we're at today, we went through the period of, you know, Colombian cartels, Mexican cartels, now we're into terrorism, crack cocaine, gangs. So a lot of state crime, traditional state crime, has now been federalized, and we're seeing a lot of that now in the federal system. And consequently, what is happening is we're seeing an increase in incarceration. Obviously, the Bureau of Prisons suffers a little bit through having to house these prisoners. We're seeing an increased cost in detention and healthcare related matters. Presently here in our area, here in Austin, we have approximately 300 federal pretrial prisoners waiting various types of hearings here in Austin. And that comes at a rate of about $52 to $54 a day plus healthcare. So you can quickly do the math, and we're just one small division in the United States, and you can see where the numbers rapidly increase. But our agency, again, went through this period of time in the 1789 of doing the simple mundane things of paying the bills, taking the census, and kind of was the federal government's, or rather the federal court's enforcement arm. And as it evolved in the 1800s, settling of the West and all that kind of good stuff that, you know, a lot of Western folklore we've seen movies and read books about, we started turning into right around the late 1800s when the United States started growing as a country. And as the country was developing, we needed agencies to come in and specialize in certain areas. And it's because essentially back in those days when we existed, we were the everything to catch-all agency. We did everything. And as the country evolved and agencies were created to handle those specific areas, we kind of sat back in the corner of a traditional courtroom right at the turn of the century, well, 1900s. Then we had, fast forwarding, we had into the 60s the presence of or the enforcement of the mafia and the creation of the Witness Security Program. I was part of the Witness Security Program. I administered that for several years, and that was during a period of time where we had the Colombian cartels, the Pablo Escobar and Emmanuel Noriega days, where we were seeing a lot of increase in witness participants coming into the program. I can see now that that's going to be rather challenging at this point because now that we're kind of going through a DTO, a Mexican cartel type phase, you know, the present trend I can only surmise when we start getting into terrorism is going to be quite challenging for the Marshal Service in terms of getting Arabic speakers. So I see that right now as something you know, on the forefront that I hope that our agency is maintaining somewhat of a head front in getting much needed Arabic speakers. Nevertheless, as we start getting into the 80s, 1980s, we start waking up a little bit from that courthouse in the courtroom in the corner. Somebody says, "Hey, how would you like to undertake the fugitive program?" So, you know, not really doing anything at the time, you said, "You know, we'll try it." And consequently, it was baby steps. There really wasn't any guidance. It was kind of, as we have 94 districts, we have 94 different ways, being that we have a presidentially appointed U.S. Marshal for each district, and the headquarters run out of D.C. So as a result, moving forward, taking these baby steps, we started capitalizing on some major fugitives, and a couple come to mind. And I think one, is what we're always taught in the academy. That, you know, this was the fugitive that put us in the direction of catching fugitives, and that was Christopher Boyce, the Falcon and the Snowman story. So from then on, the agency started, again, putting very little money in fugitive apprehension and still a lot more in courts, facilities, transportation, judicial security, courthouse security. As time evolved, our budgets got bigger in the agency, and consequently, I'm going to kind of fast forward now where we're at. We've developed fugitive task forces nationwide. We have over 85 right now. We have 6 that are congressionally funded, referred to as regional fugitive task forces. Now, the unique thing about task forces is we have one here in Austin. It's referred to as a Lone Star Fugitive Task Force. Now, most of their work is domestic in nature. We spend some time on foreign fugitives, either fugitives that have fled to other countries or fugitives that have fled from other countries to the United States. Now, we do have a vested interest in fugitives that flee to the United States from foreign countries, because as we effectively get on those cases and investigate them, we will get like treatment if we have a United States fugitive that flees abroad. So we certainly like to maintain our relationships, which I feel that has been paramount in the last several years, is forging and fostering relationships, not only with Mexico, but with also the establishment, very recent, in 2002, with a permanent office in Mexico City. We also have an office in Jamaica, Dominican Republic, and Colombia. And of course, the importance of those 4 offices right now is because that is where we have our largest contingent of U.S. fugitives fleeing to. So as we start, identifying trends, we will certainly request of Congress to open up offices in future sites. We spend a significant amount of time, energy, and money training foreign officers in fugitive investigations. We have a very good relationship with Mexico at present, and that has also, at least locally here in Austin, has benefited us as a whole in getting fugitives returned back to Austin via the extradition process or the deportation expulsion route. With that in mind, we're in a slight lull right now just due to the circumstances going on in Mexico. We're not able to, with any continuity, get our counterparts on the other side to, at present, effectively get some of the well-needed fugitives that we need back here. Granted, they have their own problems right now, and essentially with the drug trafficking or DTOs that exist over there, they certainly do intimidate the locals as well, intimidate local law enforcement. So there is that concern there, and certainly we respect that, and we certainly are not going to make them engage in fugitive apprehension on that side, on our behest, at the risk of them losing their lives or getting injured. So we're going to kind of wait for this lull to go away. If it does, and we certainly see that it'll happen, and we'll get right back to business again. We do intend on opening offices in FY11 in Guadalajara, Juarez, Monterrey, and Matamoros. So with that in mind, at least we are starting to expand our agency in those offices. We are working very, again, I can't overemphasize how intimately we're involved with Mexican law enforcement over there. We have border offices that have liaisons that we engage with daily across the border, sharing intelligence and information. So what we bring to the table in terms of establishing these task forces is several factors. One is we're able to deputize the local officer. Just like the old days, we deputize them and give them federal status. Now, what that does immediately for that local officer is it gives him nationwide jurisdiction, and furthermore, even a global reach if he needs to pursue his investigation abroad. So we also bring the infrastructure of the Marshal Service, our databases, our electronic intelligence and apparatuses that we use, assets that we use. We also bring to the table some funding or sharing of asset forfeiture funding for various types of equipment, overtime funding, things of that nature. So essentially, by bringing a local crime to the attention of a federal umbrella, it benefits the city, it benefits the community by being able to close cases rather quickly, getting these fugitives back. Because I see a lot in my 25 years of experience where we see a lot of investment of time, energy, and money on the front end of an investigation, coming up with that indictment, securing a warrant, and maybe very little effort in the apprehension phase. So I certainly would like to see, from my perspective, more funding put on the back end in apprehending these people rather than on the front end, or at least as much money, some equitable amount of money in the apprehension phase. We have liaisons, and we have presence at Interpol, U.S. NCB, National Central Bureau. We have presence in Afghanistan, as I alluded to, and Iraq, trying to establish the rule of law, the court system, the judicial security apparatus there in those countries. The Merida initiative we're part of in training the Mexican government as well as Colombia in the being relatively new in the accusatory stage development of their court system. We're bringing them into our model of protecting the judiciary, witness protection, and things of that nature that are relevant in the court environment. We've seen an explosion of extraditions and deportations to the United States recently. Mexico obviously is our leads in terms of numbers, leads in the extraditions as well as deportations, followed by Colombia. We see a lot recently here in Mexico because I believe there was a recent Mexican court ruling where the Supreme Court of Mexico, I believe, took off the table the life imprisonment provision because forever and a day, the Mexicans would not deport anyone who was subjected to a death or a life sentence. So district attorneys, prosecutors certainly had to revisit those issues and re-indict or refashion an indictment and take that off the table most of the time. So we're seeing a change, at least very recently, on some of these DTO fugitives where that is being left in place in terms of the life imprisonment. So we're seeing that change, and we're also relative to terrorism, we're seeing a couple of tools that again is affecting incarceration, detention, and that is the transportation of these high-value targets, DTOs as well as terrorism, because extraditions require the government to produce, or the court requires the government to produce that prisoner to the charging district. And some of these charging venues are, Bismarck, North Dakota. I mean, they can be small areas that require dedicated aircraft rather than commercial transportation. So now we're starting to put a lot of money into transportation and the security apparatus in getting a terrorism or a DTO fugitive back here in a charging district. Globally, what we've been involved in very recently are a couple of areas. One is the recent enactment of the Adam Walsh Act that was again thrown on our plate several years ago, and it requires the Marshal Service as a lead agency to pursue state fugitives who have crossed state lines that have a requirement to register as a sex offender. And once they've crossed state lines and made some affirmative acts to establish residence or gain employment, therein kicks in the elements of the Adam Walsh Act. Hence, that now is federal law. We've been somewhat successful here in the last calendar year, in getting some successful prosecutions and some significant time assessed. So again, this is a new area for us. It's quite hasn't been tried in the appellate circuits yet here, if I can recall, locally. But that's an area, again, we're getting sufficiently funded at this time to enforce that act. Other global initiatives that we're involved in are Operation Infrared, which is going after fugitives that are wanted on Interpol's red notice. I mean, a lot of times we just place fugitives on red notice, put out the worldwide global bulletin and hope that they get arrested. But we're actually now dedicating a time element. We're dedicating resources in Lyon, France, where Interpol's located. Also working with the International Crime Stoppers community, that if we were able to identify fugitives in a foreign country, that we're enlisting the local Crime Stoppers in that country to pursue apprehension efforts via deportation or extradition. We work very closely with the Diplomatic Security Service, DSS. They are very integral in our apprehension effort because sometimes in some of these locations globally, they are the only law enforcement presence in that country. We have deputized DSS special agents as deputies so that they're able to undertake not only their mission, but ours as well in doing an extraterritorial investigation. So we're involved in all facets of fugitive apprehension and operations, and sex offenders, again, the witness protection program, the Civilian Response Corps, which is part of the Department of State's effort to set up a whole government approach, where we've been able to augment the Civilian Response Corps with police training, judicial security training, things that are relevant to that rule of law and whole government setup in foreign countries. International building, we've provided training, again, all facets of training, establishment of fugitive apprehension programs in foreign countries, Central, South America, and Europe, as well as witness security programs in those same countries. So the agency has a relatively good track record over the years, and now have taken it upon themselves to impart their knowledge and get at least get that instilled and up and running in those countries that desire and need to have those kind of programs in place. Before I close, well, there's several other areas that I want to echo the sentiments of my two colleagues here. Chief Carter, we have a very outstanding working relationship here in Austin. I've been here in '94. We stood up the task force in 2003, and it has caught significant fugitives over the years. We have, I mean, I cannot, and I always have the opportunity when I'm ever in a public setting, to always, because I believe it, that we have an outstanding cooperation here, cooperative efforts here in Austin and Travis County. Never have I ever experienced this in 25 years where we had this kind of cooperation. So the information sharing, the intelligence sharing is there, and I can't say any more about it. In closing, in terms of what I would like to see in terms of policy implications, I kind of see a couple of areas. And of course, one is always funding. And like I kind of highlighted, I like to see funding in terms of the apprehension phase of a criminal conduct or criminal act. And I would also like to see, at least domestically, more funding provided for district attorneys or county governments in terms of getting these fugitives placed and entered into the NCIC system. I think, that is always a funding issue, but in plain words, we're seeing too many fugitives that are not subject to state extradition because they prefer to be, due to money issues, they're tied into being extradited only within the state. And I think you can see, just using our common sense, that if fugitive X can, is only wanted in Georgia and he can go do all kind of things in Florida and not be subject to extraditing or return back to Georgia, it creates more crime. And I know that recently, several years ago, Senator Biden and Durbin were entertaining legislation that were perhaps going to fund the Marshal Service sufficiently to potentially one day provide the transportation and the infrastructure apparatus to place all fugitives, state, local, and federal as well, in the NCIC system, with the Marshal Service bearing, again, financial responsibility of the transportation, which is the big issue. It's transportation and funding of officers to go and get these prisoners. That, as well as administrative subpoena authority, that's one area the agency is lacking. We've only received it relative to Adam Walsh investigations because traditionally the Marshal Service does not open criminal investigations. We're more of a reactive agency, and in that light, the only, at this point, apparatus, the administrative subpoena apparatus only avails us to undertake Adam Walsh Act investigations. And of course, you heard from Greg Thrash talking about the technology and how that's always kind of spinning and upgrading and ever developing. We have those challenges as well, finding fugitives. They work along very paramount as Greg's office would investigate a case, as well as us receiving it on the back end and trying to apprehend. We still have those same challenges. But that is all I have that is of concern to, at least locally here domestically. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hector. Thank you. Okay, we have a couple minutes where we can take a few questions. I have some of my own, but why don't I throw it out to the audience here and let them start. Sir.
Question for Mr. Reyes.
I know that was coming.
Mayor Bloomberg of New York City and Mayor Tom Menino of Boston have recently initiated a drive and enlisted the support of some 550 U.S. mayors to fix the gun background check law. I would like to ask you what, if something were done by Congress, and I might interject, I would have asked Congressman McCaul such a question since it is a congressional question, but Dr. Hazen earlier sort of unnerved me, but as I heard her, she minimized the number of guns coming from U.S. and Texas into Mexico. Your statement that a vast majority of the guns in Mexico come from U.S. and most of those from Texas has confirmed what I've read several times. And I'd like to ask you if something were done to enact a gun background check law, what effect that would have on your gun runner project.
I'm writing notes, I don't forget the second part of your question there. The legislation itself, your discussion about that, the important thing to consider for us as an agency is any legislation that's passed relating to gun laws, and we saw that with the Lautenberg Amendment to the Gun Control Act, which made crimes of domestic violence a prohibiting factor, and which really caught a lot of people who had, for whatever reason, entered a guilty plea to a domestic violence, and then all of a sudden, retroactively, they were prohibited from possessing firearms. This would be the same type of scenario that you're talking about. So if the legislation is there, we will enforce the laws that are given to us. One of the things that we have to remember, and I'll talk about the restoration of gun rights. There is legislation on the books that allows an individual who's been convicted of a felony or has been made a prohibited person to get their rights restored, their firearms possession rights. So the mechanism is in place, and at the same time, there's concurrent legislation that prohibits ATF from using any funding to do those types of investigations. So we get into the political issues there. Its effect on gun running, I don't see it having on Project Gun Runner. I don't see it as having a major effect on Project Gun Runner because the vast majority of the people doing the straw purchasing, they're doing it because they can possess those firearms. Now, it may slow them down a little bit on getting the background check done, but they are passing the instant check now to get those firearms. So I hope I answered that part of your question. We're kind of tied to the legislation that is on the books, and that's what we deal with. Regarding the number of guns going to Mexico, and this is strictly Michael Reyes, the private citizen speaking, with the information that, and somewhat as an ATF agent, the information that we have is based on what we're seeing out there. Greg mentioned that on some of the the drug trafficking and what we're seeing as a result of our investigations. The problem that we have with the guns recovered in Mexico, in my humble opinion, is the firearms traces cannot be completed, so there is not complete information that indicates this particular gun bearing this serial number was purchased in the United States and ended up being recovered in Mexico. And a lot of that has to do with misreading of numbers, something as simple as that, to the obliteration of the serial numbers on the firearms that cannot be restored. That was one of the things they're working with on Agent Zapata's murder, is the firearms had obliterated numbers, so they're working on raising numbers. So that becomes problematic for us. I hope I answered your question.
Gentleman back there.
Thank you. My name is Cesar Martinez. I'm a doctoral candidate here at the LBJ School. Actually just came back last night from Mexico City conducting some research for my dissertation. I was very pleased to see and to learn that actually cooperation between the two governments and agencies is perhaps much better than what people usually suspect it is. However, in the past month, we have seen some setbacks. First, the murder of the ICE agent, and then the revelation of the Fast and Furious operation. So I need to ask about that, obviously, given the people we have here in the panel, which has had a significant political effect in Mexico in the past week, very strong, especially in Mexican Congress. I don't know if people are familiar with the Fast and Furious operation or not. So my question was, do you think those things will affect the cooperation in the ground, or is just, or will be left just to political and diplomatic exchanges and noise, but not affect the cooperation? So what do you think about that?
Since you mentioned Fast and Furious, I think that's going to be my question.
Can you explain? I'm afraid I don't know what that
I'll
is.
get to that.
Okay.
I'll explain
All
Fast
right.
and Furious for those of
It's
you
a
who have not
movie, I
seen
know
anything
that.
on that. Regarding the cooperation with the Mexican counterparts, I think we have a good, and Hector mentioned it as well, we have good relations with the law enforcement officials in Mexico. I know when I was in McAllen and was involved in the border liaison office position, one of the primary issues is being able to sustain the cooperation. A lot of that is based on our one-to-one interaction with especially along the border, with our Mexican counterparts, much like here in law enforcement in the U.S. And then you get a transfer or a retirement or some other reason that our counterpart in Mexico is no longer in that position. So we're left to start from scratch. And I think that's what hurts us with our on the federal side, that's what hurts us with our state and local counterparts. We develop a good working relationship, and then we find out the next day that we've been transferred somewhere else where our services are needed more than where we're at now. So I think with Austin, you don't see that, and that's probably what's helped our cooperation here in Austin. Hector's been here forever. In ATF time, having been here since 2005, that is forever. And I think Greg's going to be in the same boat. You get to Austin and you don't want to leave. So I think that's a good thing for law enforcement and cooperation amongst the agencies here. I'll touch on Fast and Furious briefly because I am, because of agency restrictions, limited into what I can say in a public forum. So if you have my number, you can call me later and we can talk more. Fast and Furious, for those who have not heard, was an operation based out of Arizona that was a gun runner project operation. According to what the media is reporting and what several agents under the Whistleblower Act have come forth and said, so there are ATF agents who have talked about this, that deals with investigations where as part of a case where as part of an investigative techniques, firearms were allowed to walk. What we mean by allowed to walk is law enforcement personnel, primarily ATF, there were a few others, but primarily ATF, saw straw purchases happening and no action was taken. Reporting, just speaking just what I'm hearing in the public record, because here in Austin and in the Houston division, we're not being told much about it. It's the ongoing investigation story. So we're told very little about it, so I, like everyone else, am getting a lot from the media. The numbers vary, but it's in the hundreds of guns that are alleged to have been let walk. Some of which have made it, most of which have probably made it into Mexico, if true, and some of which may have been recovered at the scene where the Border Patrol agent was killed not too long ago. I can tell you, and we as first-line supervisors that run these types of investigations, suffer some fallback after something like that happens. And again, I don't know what the final answer is on that. I can tell you it's been a long-standing policy of my office and me in particular, much to there have been occasions where I've had to talk to other agency supervisors as to why I'm particularly ICE, and he understands where I'm coming from, where I don't allow guns to walk in this city. In the 30 counties that we cover. The problem that I have here in Austin is a number of guns come out of the Dallas area, coming south from the Dallas area or anywhere up north on 35, going south past my area of jurisdiction or my area of coverage, further down 35. And I've made it plenty clear to everyone involved in those investigations that if they're following a load coming down and they have surveillance, and there are techniques that we use to keep track of those surveillance, if it ends up in Austin and goes any further than a gas station from 35, they will be taken into custody. And we may lose the case, but I will not let guns walk in my area of responsibility. And that is for the Houston Field Division. I can speak to that because I'm currently supervising 6 of the offices. I've got the 2 offices in McAllen, Austin, Laredo, and 2 groups in San Antonio. That is a standard policy for ATF in the Houston Field Division, and I can tell you, in speaking to the SAC from Dallas, in the Dallas Field Division. So specifically Fast and Furious, I can only speak as to what I've read in the media, and because I'm receiving very little other information. We are waiting to see what the results of that are, especially those of us in ATF.
Okay, great. We started a little early, and I know we're all eager to listen to Admiral Inman and hear what he has to say at the end of our day here. But I'd like to close this panel by posing just 2 questions to each of you, and you can pick which one you'd like to answer. So the first one is, how well have your institutions kept up with the changes, say, particularly over the last decade? I was impressed to hear that the law enforcement agencies all share the same jurisdictional lines. In the federal government, that is, in fact, not the case, as you probably know. So the State Department's East Asia Bureau is not the same as the Defense Department's East Asia and so on in the CIA. So I think that's interesting, and it also seems like there's great cooperation. So perhaps your institutions have, in fact, kept up, but I'd be interested in your views. And Bobby, too, what laws do we need to really focus on, laws and institutional changes to deal with these non-state actors? The other thing I was struck listening to you all was similarities in, say, IED networks in Iraq. When I was in Iraq, I got to listen to a lot of briefings that I can't really talk about here about the IED networks.
We're all friends.
Yeah. But when you were talking about the phones, for example, and when you were talking the intimidation tactics and other things, I wonder to what extent do you think the drug gangs and cartels are learning from terrorist and insurgent networks, even if informally? Do we think they're visiting their websites and maybe learning tips? So to what extent do you think that might be true? So let me just go ahead and turn to each of you to answer either one of those.
I'll go first. As to the question of laws that might be useful, legal change to facilitate our fight against this problem, I'm not sure that's the center of gravity in where we need to have the attention focused, but there are things that do come up under this heading. One thing we can, and to some extent do, and can usually do more of, would be to deploy our financial tools in terms of freezing assets, blocking assets, and criminalizing transactions with people who are non-citizens abroad who are subject to sanctions. We do a great deal of this in the context of counterterrorism finance. There's some amount of it in relation to drug kingpins, and has been something we've done for quite some time. We could probably be doing a lot more in this area. This is an area in which international intelligence cooperation is central to actually being able to do it effectively, but it's something we could be doing more of. The other legal thing to mention, it's not so much a question of new laws, it's about resourcing something that was mentioned by somebody earlier. Mexico is undergoing this incredible transformation from an accusatorial system to a U.S.-style adversarial system of prosecution. Basically what that means is they're shifting from a process in which the judge is sort of the investigating and prosecuting entity to something that looks like what we do. It's an extraordinarily difficult cultural transformation. We're putting a lot of money and expertise and training from the Justice Department into it. You probably can't put enough into it. At the same time, actually making this stick is not really a function of how much money and training and expertise we ultimately give. It's commonly observed that the arrest rates in Mexico aren't actually that bad, but the conviction rates are non-existent in this area. There's frequent arrests, and this might have been said this morning. I missed the beginning of y'all's presentations. There's frequently big arrests, but rarely does an arrest ever result in an actual conviction. And there's so much more as to why that is than what we can accomplish with support to the criminal justice system there, unfortunately.
Great. Thanks, Bobby. Greg?
Yeah, thank you. With respect to intimidation tactics and telephones and the changes that we've seen there, we do know for a fact that the intimidation tactics that are being used in Mexico, and it was talked about this morning, do mock what's going on or what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we do know for a fact by talking to, through sources that they learned, the Mexicans have learned from the jihadists and the terrorists in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. As far as our bread and butter in law enforcement is information. Bottom line, we can't do the job without information. We also know for a fact that because of these intimidation tactics that are being employed in Mexico, that the information flow that we once had is, I don't have a specific figure, but I can tell you that our information flow has dwindled as a result of this, so their intimidation tactics are working.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Michael?
I'll talk about the changes in institutions that you brought up. I think one of the biggest things, and I think we're all seeing it in federal law enforcement, is trying to keep up with the technology that's available and access to information. I know with the Intelligence Center, we all tie into that and share the information. What we're looking at doing is using different platforms to where the agents themselves can get that information from their cars rather than have to go back to the office or call into the office. They can do it real time, and a lot of different platforms are being looked at to doing that. Again, security of the networks is something that is really the impeding thing. Some of you may have seen I carry 2 phones just because I can't get information on the one from work, mostly personal, but we're growing through that and trying to figure out how to get the information yet maintain the security of the information. And again, all that is tied to budgets. All the work that we're doing in that area from our science and technology arena is on hold until we get a budget. So it's all budget driven. And I think Chief Carter understands where I'm coming from with budgets.
That's great,
And
Michael.
in reference,
Thank you. Hector, yeah.
in reference to the Marshal Service, what we've seen, at least as an institution in the last decade, is, again, emergent technology that we're using, that we're employing in an effort to undertake fugitive investigations, as well as for the marshals as well. We're now in the phase of webcams and iPad 2s and again, encrypted technology. So I believe, plus, of course, Congress's specific funding for Southwest border initiatives. So we've benefited, even though we're way up here in Central Texas, being in the Western Judicial District of Texas, we benefit immensely by a specially enacted legislation that is geared for border enforcement.
If I could go back to the technology thing, and it was mentioned earlier about fragmented law enforcement. We work that way in the federal system themselves. The agents in charge or the marshals for each particular geographic area operate their own way of doing business within the parameters of the agency itself. But they operate primarily or really independently. And one of the things that we're seeing is the ability to leverage each other's technology. The Marshal Service brings some great technology for finding fugitives that we can use for our gun trafficking investigations. And I don't think they get better than DEA at running wiretaps. Our agency is just too strapped to do those, so we would work those with DEA. So again, it's the interagency cooperation, both in the intelligence side, but also the tactical side.
Outstanding. Please join me in thanking this outstanding panel. Thank you so much, guys. I learned a lot. Thank you very much.